just a couple of minutes late. So today we have the pleasure to hosting Sue. Sue Keay doesn't need much of an introduction, I think, for most of you. Well, I think there might be a few people that haven't worked with her yet, I guess. So we'll give a quick one. Sue was, well, as most of you know, was the CEO of the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision Centre that recently finished. Among many things she did at the time, she was the chair of the National Robotics Roadmap, which is the first robotics roadmap that was set in Australia. We're working on the second version now. And then joined CSIRO as the head of the cyber physical system department over there for years. And then this year joined, well, last year, Queensland AI Hub as a CEO. After all the achievements, she's known as to be a superstar of STEM in Queensland, in Australia, and in the world as well. I think very well known by now. So I think she's here to talk to us about the Queensland AI Hub. I think a lot of people may not know of it or may not know much what it does. So I think, and it's very relevant to us, obviously. So that would be great to have her present this. And as a shout out, this talk was also advertised to the IEEE Queensland Robotic and Automation Society and Control Society. So there might be some public outside of QT as well listening to this. So,
okay, thanks very much, Thierry. And thanks everyone for joining today. So I know I've only got 40 minutes, so if I speak quickly, I'm sorry, you have to forgive me. And Thierry did do a great job of introducing me, but I just thought I would just start off, if I can get my slides moving, with a little bit of an introduction as well. Sorry, just see how I can minimize this. Oh, shivers. So just to show that, you know, it's okay to have non-linear career paths. That's how I like to describe my journey so far. My background was actually as an earth sciences researcher, but you can see I've done a number of different things. At some point, I moved out of being a researcher and focused more on research management and commercialization, and that led me to a few different areas. I worked with UniQuest commercializing social sciences research, have worked with commercializing water recycling research, and then the opportunity to help set up the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision came along, and that was where I spent quite a few years very happily here before moving on to CSIRO and now the Queensland AI Hub. And just to give a bit of some framing around this, because there seems to be, for reasons I'm not quite sure I understand, a lot of arguments over, you know, what artificial intelligence is and isn't, and a lot of people who will feel very uncomfortable to be described as an artificial intelligence researcher if I was to put that label on them. And Garima heard this yesterday at the Brisbane Street Art Festival, where the idea behind that was we paired AI researchers with street artists to give a visual representation of what artificial intelligence is, to start some public conversations about the technology and what it might mean for everybody in our society. And, you know, without fail, all of the people that we labeled as AI researchers went, oh, I wouldn't describe myself as an AI researcher. And that seems to be quite common, and I'm not quite sure why we seem to think when we describe this to people, often we like to only really represent machine learning and nothing else. And if you don't do machine learning, then you're not a real artificial intelligence researcher, because I think that that's short-sighted. And the reason that I've been really pushing, and I use this diagram to try and show the range of artificial intelligence that the Queensland AI Hub represents, is because if you have a look around the world, and this is why it's important, there is a huge amount of investment in artificial intelligence specifically, not in robotics, not in machine learning, not in computer vision. It is more broadly towards artificial intelligence. And if you take a step back from that and go, well, I'm not part of the artificial intelligence, then you're actually taking a step back from a big opportunity. Now, we're not seeing this opportunity come to fruition in Australia yet, but you only have to look at the worldwide trends in spending, and specifically a lot of countries who now have artificial intelligence strategies, including Mauritius, the Maldives, to know that actually being associated with artificial intelligence is a good thing at the moment if you're interested in increasing investment in the sort of research that you do. So what's the Queensland AI Hub? We're a private company that was formed in response to a Queensland government tender to actually form the Queensland AI Hub. And the reason the Queensland government thought that this was a good idea was actually on the back of a very successful meetup group founded by one of the early researchers here with the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision, Yuxi Leitner, along with Natalie Renz. They formed the first Brisbane AI meetup, and very quickly that group got to almost 3,000 members. Now, a lot of what that group did was actually helping people to upgrade their skills. Now, some of you won't remember this ancient history, but back when the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision formed, it was back when deep learning was really starting to have an impact, and people were starting to appreciate the sort of benefits that it could have, particularly in areas like robotics. And so there are a lot of people in the community who wanted to upskill, but they didn't want to have to go back and do a 3-year university degree just to figure out how to do deep learning. And so they formed communities where they could learn this from a lot of those massively open online courses that we know Peter Cork has also led the way in developing. And so they have self-taught themselves these skills. And what we've ended up with is actually quite a strong AI community here in Brisbane. And that should probably not come as a surprise. I'll go through why that shouldn't be a surprise later on. But essentially, that gave some indications to the Queensland government that there was stuff happening in artificial intelligence here, and perhaps they should be keeping an eye on it. So the reason we exist is to help continue to build that AI community, to showcase a lot of the local AI talent and technologies, because I do believe it is mainly a well-kept secret. And I'll go through some of our local success stories a bit later on in this presentation. Another aim of ours is to encourage the adoption of AI technologies, particularly by our large corporates and our government agencies, and wherever possible to link them in with the local capability that we have already developed here. They want us to position Queensland as a global AI centre. At this point, we probably blur the line between Queensland and Australia. It probably doesn't make a big difference to people overseas. But what is important is at the moment, Australia has been relatively successful at maintaining, retaining and attracting AI talent. But given the level of investment that's happening overseas, that's a very tenuous position. So we have to see how we can make sure that the talent and technologies that we're currently developing have reasons to stay here in Australia. And if at all possible, we need Australia to be an attractive place for AI talent and technologies to grow. And so part of what we're doing and working in conjunction with groups like Queensland AI Meetup is to help develop our AI talent and upskill the general community. Why Queensland? Perhaps I don't have to ask this question of anyone here, but certainly our southern states often ask that question. But one of the reasons why I think we have an opportunity here is because we do have the fastest growth in startups here in Queensland. We have a very strong tech background, which a lot of people don't appreciate because it's not necessarily called tech. We actually develop 60% of the world's mining software right here in Queensland. And so we have got a strong tech base. It's probably just not recognised as such. I know from working here and then also working at CSIRO that here in Queensland, we have Australia's greatest capability in cyber physical systems. That's a strength we really need to build from. And we have a fantastic research and education base. So I probably could have pulled out a stat that, profiled QUT here, but all of our universities actually rank very well in world rankings in terms of various aspects of AI research. And Australia has the advantage compared to many other nations of having a stable and progressive political climate. So we should be able to build a case to get people to start building their AI companies right here. And so some of the things that we're looking at doing at the moment is actually developing a Queensland AI strategy. Now, I don't have any control over the Australian government and whether they will do an AI strategy or not. We know in the next budget, they will be releasing an action plan, which I don't really consider a strategy. But I think where we need to be is where other countries are, and having a very well articulated position on where we want to be as a nation where artificial intelligence is concerned. To support that, we're in the process of doing a capability map that actually shows how many companies we have here in Australia that are working in the area. We're running incubator and accelerator programs. We've already worked in conjunction with Austrade to develop some landing pad programs to Israel, Germany, and England to help our local AI companies to expand to different export markets. We now are developing what we call transformer labs, where we bring in corporate and government companies and match them up with both researchers and our local AI capability to help them develop solutions to AI problems. And to help so that we're not just seen as a state-based initiative, we're working in with the South Australia's AI Lab. We've formed something we call the Australia AI Collective, so that where we need to, we can have a national voice. One of the things that we have done is we made a response to the federal government's AI action plan discussion paper. So we consulted with a range of different people here, and we put forward 136 policy recommendations, which might seem like overkill. But one of the advantages of being a slow follower, as Australia currently is in terms of having an AI strategy, is that we can have a look at all the other strategies that other countries have put together and cherry pick all their best recommendations. And these are just a couple of the ones that we have put forward. But in that respect, I mean, I think we actually have we can really hit the ground running if we can get the government to focus on developing an AI strategy. There are a lot of good policies that we can see working in other countries that we can take advantage of. Now, the other thing I think needs to change, and this is where I think it's important for us to have a vision, and have our own strategy, is that at the moment, according to the Australian government's AI action plan, this is where they see our vision for the future: to be a leading digital economy by 2030, that we use AI technologies responsibly, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think this is good enough. If you have a look at other countries like South Korea, for example, they have the stated ambition to be the world's in the top 3 of the world's countries in terms of AI by 2024. And they actually have metrics that they can put forward to show when they have reached that target. I think we need to be similarly ambitious. So, we've put forward, and it could be a number of different things, but at the moment, the one we're working towards is being the #1 investment choice for trusted AI. I think this is actually an area where Australia can play a key role, particularly in the APAC region, because in general, a lot of the way that our technologies are developed have to be consistent with the values of the society in which they're developed in. And I think for other countries to be able to purchase technologies that they are confident meet certain standards and certain ethical frameworks is quite attractive. So I think that's where we should be heading. So at the moment, as I said, we're putting together an artificial intelligence strategy specifically for Queensland, which we're hoping will have, I guess, more broad international influence. And please look up Queensland AI Hub online if you'd like to participate. We'll be having a series of roundtables, but you can also fill out a survey if you don't want to participate online or in person, and give us your views on what you think Australia's future could look like. Some of the things that we're looking to focus on is how we can grow Queensland's AI ecosystem, how we can develop areas of strategic advantage in AI, and I'd argue that robotics is one of those. How we can use AI to transform Queensland's economy and society, and how we can ensure that we have broad-based social prosperity, because we're never going to have acceptance of artificial intelligence unless we can demonstrate that it actually is beneficial to all members of our society. And why is this all coming about now? Well, I think everyone here probably knows better than most that there is a reason why there's such a focus on artificial intelligence now. I mean, artificial intelligence has been around arguably since the days of the ancient Greeks, where they put forward this idea that there were these beings that had, that were not real, but who had some level of intelligence that were helping humanity. but I think it really is just that confluence of, the computer processing power being at the point where we can have things like robotic vision, which we weren't able to have in the past. That now means that there is such an arms race in artificial intelligence across the world. And that's why it's important that Australia pays attention. So I probably don't have to go through some of these slides, but we've come a long way. In some ways we've come a long way, in some ways we haven't come a long way. The world's first robots on the factory floor were done by General Motors back in the 1960s. And yet, as you've probably seen Peter Cork illustrate, when you look at a modern car manufacturing plant like the Tesla car manufacturing plant in Fremont, California, in many respects, it hasn't changed. Those robots are still caged away from people. But as we know, with the application of computer vision more common in robotics, that's going to change. And we have a number of local examples of companies that are also helping to see that change. One of the other big changes that is happening, of course, is really around the cost and price point for some of these technologies. So, in days gone past, for you to really deploy industrial automation, you would have had to have been spending, upwards of $2 million per unit on those big KUKA, or even more on those KUKA robotic arms. Whereas now this is a local company based up in Toowoomba called Huntington Dynamics that is producing reasonably precise robotic arm via 3D printing, which you can buy for less than $10,000. So as we start to see the development of more of these technologies, they're making them more accessible and allowing people to access automation from smaller companies who were never able to do that in the past. You probably are aware that right here in Brisbane, we have a great history of, leading the world in terms of automation of transportation. This is the Port of Brisbane, where the world's first automated straddle carriers developed at University of Sydney were first deployed and are still in operation today. So we were the world's first country to automate our ports, which is something we should be proud of. Obviously, we're now seeing robotics in logistics just completely take off. It's one of the most popular areas of the deployment of robots in the world at the moment. Unfortunately, not aware of too many Australian companies in this space, but that will happen. The other area where Australia is leading the world in these areas, of course, is in mining. Australia was also the first country in the world to automate many of its mine sites. And the key objective there is actually to have what they call zero entry mining, where in the future they hope to not have any humans on mine sites. That doesn't mean that they won't be employing people. It's just the people won't be on the mine sites. They'll be in remote operation centers controlling the robots operating on those mine sites. Some of the work that was happening when I was at CSIRO is about combining a lot of these technologies so that they can truly be autonomous. So many of you are probably familiar with some of this work, but CSIRO has a team competing in the most recent DARPA Subterranean Challenge. And a lot of the work that is being done there is around how you can reliably map and share maps between different robots to help navigate in these unknown underground environments, to give enough situational awareness to give an operator back up at the surface information that would indicate whether it's safe, for example, to send people down into that environment. And, I think, again, Australia's performed very well in this. At the last challenge, the team was 4th overall in the world and has improved in every one of the competitions. But certainly they were the first team to actually be able to have each of the different robots share their map and actually correct each other's maps of the environment. And that's the sort of step change that we need to be able to have these robots truly operate autonomously in environments where there is no ready communications available. You're probably, again, very familiar with a lot of this work. Swarm Farm up at Emerald worked with QUT on the original basis for the robots that they deploy for weeding. But again, it's a local Queensland company that uses artificial intelligence. Infarm does a similar job, except actually uses drones that communicate with tractors to be able to detect where weeds are in fallow grounds and go and remove them. In space, I mean, it may not seem like a lot, but a lot of the navigation systems within the Gilmore Spaces operations rely on artificial intelligence. Many of you might be familiar with a local company, Bai5, that produces this Ozbot robot. They first developed it for emergency response for the tactical response unit in the police force, but they're now looking at how it can be applied in firefighting and in other emergency response scenarios. Another local company that has a test range out at Dalby is called Guardtech Targets. For those of you familiar with the University of Sydney spin-out marathon robotics, in some ways it's quite similar but different. What they do is provide live fire training targets for the military. And in this case, what they are fake tanks. But the tanks have to operate they use artificial intelligence to control where the tank is going, because it's very important for our armed forces to be able to figure out how to respond to threats that are being guided by artificial intelligence. It's one of the key areas that our military has to look to in the future. And, again, I'm putting this forward because you might not be aware that a lot of this work is happening right here in Queensland. And obviously, we've got Boeing's Loyal Wingman project. The Loyal Wingman is being manufactured here in Brisbane. Its first test flight was in South Australia. But again, we have a drone test facility out at Cloncurry now, which would encourage, hopefully, the development of more of these technologies. We have a local company called Machine Genes that uses complex mathematical modelling to work out when we're likely to see failures in engines and turbines, which is applied by the military as well as in other industries. And this is one of my favourite companies, although I don't think it's Queensland based actually. This is called a company called Oxus that develops these robots, which they call the Blue Bottles. And they are just autonomous systems that go out and essentially surveil our oceans, because we can't have enough Navy boats out there actually having a look at what's going on around our borders. And we have a huge, amount of border to be able to surveil. So that's the purpose of these instruments. And then there's also a lot of work going on to just in servicing a lot of the different technologies that groups like our Navy are putting together and deploying in our oceans at the moment. This is an example of some artificial intelligence developed by a company called Athena AI, which is a combination of two local robotics companies, Skyborn Technologies and Cyborg. And essentially what they're doing is applying computer vision to be able to identify red cross zones. There's also been talk about how we can use this to help protect areas of national significance, for example, areas that are of cultural significance to our First Nations people. How can we use this technology, particularly during wartime, when obviously that's not necessarily the first thing on people's minds. But if you can already pre-identify areas which shouldn't be targeted, that is an important first step. And I haven't covered the whole range of different things that are happening in terms of the application of artificial intelligence in health and biotech. This is just a couple of examples. Some of you may have heard of a local company called Maxwell Plus. They have developed an AI system to have a look at images of prostate cancer and have commercialized this product now. So it's very successful in helping to in the early identification of prostate cancer, and obviously they're looking at other applications as well. Another local company developed from technology that was first developed from University of Queensland research is called ResApp. And essentially it allows you, through the use of a mobile phone, to diagnose someone's respiratory illness from their cough. So you can imagine how useful this is during something like COVID. One of the big challenges for the application of AI in health at the moment is that, you know, even in the US, it's very hard to get any of this diagnostic equipment rated for use on its own. It can only be an aid to physicians. It can't actually be making a diagnosis on its own, if that makes sense. So otherwise it would be rated as medical equipment and have to go through a much higher level of FDA approvals. So in this case, ResApp can be used as a tool by a clinician, but certainly doesn't replace a clinician and doesn't allow people to self-diagnose based on their cough. Although, you know, in the future, perhaps that is an opportunity for that technology. And there are a number of examples in infrastructure and construction, you know, of the use of particularly drones in terms of inspecting our critical infrastructure. There's a local company up in central Queensland that has developed this safety helmet, which is being deployed in the new Snowy Hydro scheme to protect workers who are operating around heavy machinery. There's a local company up in Townsville, again, actually created out of research from James Cook University, where they're developing a whole group of sensors for structural health monitoring, and have since spun out a company called Lixia. Another local success story is a company you may have heard of called Movis that actually uses AI to interpret vibration monitoring on equipment for preventative maintenance purposes. And this is being widely deployed now, particularly in things like, you know, where they, can't remember the term for it, you know, where they are filling bottles and doing that sort of work. It's proven very popular in that area, but there is no real end to the type of applications it can be applied to. And then in services, I mean, you know, Dominos really used this as a marketing ploy rather than, I don't know that anyone's actually seen Drew operating in Brisbane, but, you know, the idea behind it, you know, makes sense. Most pizzas are ordered within a kilometre of a Domino's store. So if you could have an autonomous delivery system, it makes sense. But we're also seeing AI deployed widely by our real estate agents. Again, this is a Brisbane company that has been developing this artificial intelligence. There's a company probably very few of you have heard of whose founder is based on the Sunshine Coast, Zach Johnson, called Sandra, which actually applies natural language processing to develop much more realistic narratives for both gaming and also for films. So some of their key clients are Disney and HBO. And again, you probably wouldn't be aware that, you know, this company has a founder based here in the Sunshine Coast. Many of you may have heard of Popgun AI though. Their app Splash, I don't know what the usage is at the moment, but it's a very popular application that allows you to create music using artificial intelligence, again, based right here in Brisbane, and was founded with the support of Mawson Labs, which also funds a couple of other AI startups, such as Replica AI. Another little known fact, although Queensland can't take too much credit, only one of the band members was actually from Queensland, but Australia did win the world's first Eurovision AI song contest with this group, which is called Uncanny Valley. So look them up. Their song, Beautiful the World, was the #1 AI song. I think there is going to be a second Eurovision AI song contest coming up. So if you're feeling so inclined, get your music ready. But again, I'm put that forward just to illustrate that Australia, and in particular Queensland, are doing some pretty cool things in artificial intelligence. And it's just, you know, I think telling the stories of the type of work that we're doing is a way to encourage people to have a look at what actual opportunities there are here, rather than necessarily having to look outside. Now, another perhaps little known fact is that Jeremy Howard, who is an Australian who moved over to Silicon Valley and founded Kaggle, and is also the founder of Fast AI, has moved to Brisbane. He's decided to leave the United States and is going to be based here in Brisbane now. what we're doing with Queensland AI Meetup Group is we're resurrecting the Fast AI courses. There's no guarantee that Jeremy will be part of those, but at the moment I know that both QUT and UQ are talking about a shared appointment of Jeremy, so that when he runs in-person Fast AI courses, you can expect that we're going to be, once travel is back on the agenda, it will make Brisbane a hotspot for people who want to learn about AI. People are prepared to travel great distances to be able to get in. This Fast AI is free, so anyone can go online and use it. You can go online and play with it right now, and that's exactly what Jeremy's vision is. He wants to make AI accessible to everyone. However, when he does do in-person courses, it attracts people from all around the world, and so it's a fantastic opportunity for us to position Queensland as a destination for people who are interested in artificial intelligence. But if you're just interested in the Fast AI course in general, I'd encourage you to either enroll in it if you like, or volunteer. So essentially we take people through over about 10 weeks, pair you up with mentors, you'll form teams and you'll go through the Fast AI course together. It just helps, maintain the motivation. There's nothing stopping you from just going online and doing it yourself at any time. But what we found is that people tend to like doing it in this supported manner. And also quite a few people who were involved in the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision ended up being mentors for the program. So if this is of interest to you, please get in touch. We're actually recruiting mentors at the moment for our first cohort to go through. And I'd encourage you all to stay in touch, with the Queensland AI Meetup Group. And you can probably find out a lot about what's happening in AI if you just go online and join the Queensland AI Hub community as well. And I encourage you to think of yourselves as part of the AI community more broadly. I mean, I know there's lots of different tribes and different identities that you can put towards, that you can place on yourself. But I encourage you to be part of that broader AI community, because that is where we're hoping that we can have some traction in terms of funding that would help support research, would help to support the development of new industries. And I think the most important thing that we can do is stop actually labeling AI and robotics as part of other things. At the moment, what we see a lot of is that a lot of initiatives in AI and robotics are funded under things like the the Manufacturing Modernisation Fund, and are never really pulled out as AI. If you have a look at a country like the US, they're very specific in making sure that the funding that they put towards AI is actually mapped as AI, so that you can actually see what the return on investment is going to be. And they're investing $300 billion, because that's how much they think they're going to need to be able to catch up with where the Chinese are currently at. Now, we need to just be aware of this. We're not expecting any miracles in the next federal budget, and we're also expecting that the federal budget will probably hide any money towards AI. The money is that maybe there'll be about $250 million over 4 years coming up in the budget, but it might not necessarily be labelled AI, and that's nowhere near enough money for anyone who's actually had a look at how much other countries are investing, particularly countries the size of Australia. But you've got to start somewhere. So I'm trying not to be doom and gloom about it, but I think what is important is to keep pushing this message that we're not going to see the benefits of the talent and technologies that we already have here if we don't actually celebrate AI and robotics as industries in their own right, and not just adjuncts to the mining industry or to the manufacturing industry. We really need to be able to proudly say that Australia and Queensland has a tech industry. And somehow, and I know you've got a minister's visit this afternoon, somehow we need to get that message through. Michael, I am looking at you. Because I'm not quite sure where the message is falling down, but there seems to be a lot of emphasis placed on how we can support companies to apply these technologies, and not enough emphasis placed on the additional benefits that we get if those technologies are developed here. I mean, you'd think that that'd be a fairly simple economic case to put forward, but it doesn't seem to be a battle that we're winning at the moment. So in terms of what we can do the most to support robotics and AI, it's really about proudly going out there and talking about Australia as having our own tech sector and talking about some of the amazing benefits. So AI can't really claim this win, but some of you might be aware that only 2 weeks ago, a Brisbane-based company called Octopus Deploy raised 200 million Australian dollars. You know, again, you probably never heard of Octopus Deploy, but for us to keep ignoring the fact that we have a technology sector in Australia, I think is very damaging. We need to be able to do whatever we can to support that, so that, I'm going to sound like a broken record, so that the talent and technologies that we develop here in Australia can stay here in Australia, and so we can attract more people to come here, so we can get a better critical mass. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to say, and happy to take questions.
Any questions from the room first? Michael, of course. You go first.
I noticed you said something about ethical frameworks. Was there any ethics recommendations in that report?
There is a published guideline or ethical framework that has been published by Data 61. However, the most common feedback that I get is that from a developer's perspective, it's not specific enough to really guide people on how they can ensure that they're necessarily meeting that framework. In some ways, I wonder whether it needs to be a reverse engineering approach, where you actually, once you've, as much as possible, you try and make sure that you're not imparting any bias into the algorithms you develop. But there are ways that you could test that afterwards, because we know what the composition of the general community is. And if you then go out and test it and you discover that, for example, disabled people aren't able to access the benefits of the technology that you've developed, well, there's a problem. Then you have to question, has it been developed ethically? But I appreciate at the moment there is a gap. There's a lot of material written about ethics. There are ethical frameworks, but when it comes to actually putting that into practice, most companies find that that's, particularly if they're a little company, find that quite difficult territory to navigate.
Just a question. So as I understand it, just to talk about another tech area, solar power, right? So as I understand it, large companies who don't give a shit about the environment are investing in solar power because fundamentally they think they're going to earn money from it. And I always think of that as, in some ways, a healthy sign that a sector is going well, when you don't have to have the cultural change or anything. It's just fundamentally, it makes economic sense. Are there any niches in which that's happening or starting to happen in Australia? Because a lot of what you're talking about is cultural change, which is hard and slow and takes a lot of effort, right?
Yeah. I just think we're not seeing the scale of investment that we need to see to actually shift the dial. I think another challenge that we have is that for whatever reason, we don't have corporate venture capital here in Australia, and our superannuation funds have a lot to answer for in that. If I knew how you could influence our superannuation funds, that would probably be the most direct way that we could influence that particular thing. And I think, you'd only have to look at other economies to recognise that there must be economic benefits, or they wouldn't be investing. It's just a matter of following the money.
But are any of the big tech companies in Australia investing large amounts of money even internally in AI? Like they've hired a big AI team or any of that stuff?
Well, apparently Amazon's Alexa has more job openings than all of Google. So I guess that's an indication.
I was wondering, like what you said at the beginning, that there was a number of people that were basically saying they didn't feel they work in AI, or they're like in that field. So I can see that some people are particular about the definitions, and and you mentioned early, like at the moment, it seems if you don't do deep learning, people don't call that AI. In the past, AI meant something very different that was not machine learning, but still wasn't, like roboticists would say, I don't do AI, and some pure AI people. So it has evolved, but I guess more besides that, I wonder if you have a feel for whether there is also, and to what extent there is a feeling, I guess, from some people that little bit scared of the AI word and the bad publicity around it, and how much it is possibly why some don't want to be labeled AI despite the opportunity.
Oh, 100%. I think it's those two words are a barrier in their own right. I mean, and some people are now moving towards talking about augmented intelligence. So I guess people are trying to do it from different ways. But I mean, in some ways, the horse is bolted because we're one of the very few countries left in the world that don't have an AI strategy, and every other country has labelled theirs an AI strategy. So in some respects, we're stuck with that terminology, at least in the short term. I mean, it might be that we have to pivot in a little while and then, you know, we'll talk about ourselves being augmented intelligence researchers. I don't know. All I can say, though, is that where the money is going at the moment, they are labelling artificial intelligence, but it is a real barrier, particularly for public acceptance. And I would argue even with politicians as well. We know, I've heard directly that a lot of our federal politicians equate artificial intelligence with job loss. And, you know, that's problematic because I think, you know, probably most people, you know, involved with this seminar would probably actually equate it with job creation. So that's kind of one aspect of the argument. But the other thing that I find puzzling is that even if you were to accept that proposition, that artificial intelligence equals job loss, well, then what are we doing about it? You know, that doesn't make the problem go away. Not funding artificial intelligence research does not make that problem go away. And so I guess I'd probably like to see, I mean, in some ways, I think we have to tackle it head on by actually starting to use the terminology more commonly and having those discussions. And that was where this Brisbane Street Art Festival was really interesting, because all of the street artists had, in some cases, quite negative views of artificial intelligence before they started working with people who were in the field, even if they didn't like it, they didn't know in the field, but who apply artificial intelligence. And when they were able to see what some of the opportunities were, their views changed. But I don't think we're actually having enough of those conversations. And you've got to start somewhere.
One thing I would very personally argue against it when people say the AI, like this little article there, just like gets something on a nerve a bit, like it feels like it's an entity on its own, and it sort of going to go somewhere. And I think that's these kind of things I would really prefer that people don't do that. It's a tool, it's a technique, it's not a thing as such. But yeah.
So you talked a lot about trying to attract people to invest in applied AI stuff, both commercially and to a lesser extent in universities. Do you have any? Do you do anything about trying to get people to invest into like basic research into like artificial general intelligence, for example, something that can't really be commercialized easily in any foreseeable time?
Well, not specifically, but I did get the opportunity to put forward some projects to the federal government, which I've got no sense of whether they would listen or not. But certainly a large number of those projects were just directed towards basic research. But it wasn't more specific.
I got a question from online from Will, who just joined us as new professor in the group, Will Brown. Apart from what do you consider are the biggest barriers to AI adoption? Does this include over-promising in media and science fiction?
Yeah, that's a challenge, but I think it's a challenge everywhere. I think it's in Australia, it is a cultural issue, but it's also an issue of our industry structure. So we're a nation of SMEs. A lot of countries say that about themselves, but if you have a look at Queensland in particular, 90% of Queenslanders are employed by companies with 20 people or less. Now, I would argue that in some cases that can make companies more innovative, but in other cases that can actually really challenge their innovation capacity, because with only 20 people, you probably have to, or less, you're focusing on your core operations, and it can be quite hard to actually free up someone's time to be having a look at these new technologies. The other barrier that I think we have that is going to be hard to overcome until we come up with enough tools to support SMEs is that there just simply are not enough integrators. So it's okay for bigger companies who can call in a PwC, a Deloitte, regardless of whether you agree with how they deploy things or not, at least they can help people on the pathway to deploying artificial intelligence, and people know who to go and speak to. But when you're an SME and you can't afford those services, where do you go? So that's actually one of the key things the Queensland AI Hub are looking to do, particularly when we go out into the regions, is more around trying to form communities of practice. Much as the Queensland AI meetup has self-organised, we need to empower people to be able to feel confident about what these technologies are and how they can apply them. And that's not an easy task, but I see that as one of the biggest barriers in terms of application. But the other barrier that we have is when you compare us with a country like South Korea, they have quite a different culture around things like esports. And people will go to whole concerts, I can't even remember what they're called, where you're looking at an avatar, you're not even watching a real person. And so I think in general, the cultural attitude towards artificial intelligence is quite different, because it's something people already feel comfortable with, because they are engaging with it by playing esports, by going to concerts done by avatars, not humans. And I think Australia is well away from that. I'm not suggesting that that's where we should go, but I'm just pointing out that that's also a barrier to acceptance.
The follow-up, Will?
No, I agree completely that integration through a hub, I'm sitting at the ARM hub, is the right way to go to bring people together, to spread the ideas, to get collaboration. I fully agree with all of that. I think the Asian countries that have Shinto type religions, where artificial intelligence systems other than humans being intelligent is much more accepted, is very important to how we can grow the acceptance of AI. But thank you for a great talk. And yep, agree with those barriers and what we can do about them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we might be running out of time. So if you have, maybe the last one from James, and then we'll conclude on this. Better be a good one.
Yeah. So you talked about the challenges a bit. One of the problems I see is that, let's say as an individual, you think that AI or robotics can be applied to a certain problem. I don't have the funds to necessarily investigate whether that problem can actually be solved with AI or robotics. And maybe I'm still even 90% confidence, even if I can't solve that problem, I'm going to solve the problem. So how do we allow individuals access to either the funds or resources in order to engage in a little bit of that applied research in order to first initiate even the idea of a startup or technology creation, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I think if you're able to engage with some of the industries that are, I guess, forward-thinking and progressive in terms of the application of artificial intelligence, that would probably be my first start, because they might be prepared to invest in actually.
But what if the problem that you see is not in one of those industries? For example, let's say it's in hospitality. I don't see hospitality or a restaurant going, an individual restaurant going, oh, yep, I'm going to invest 50 grand into you, that because you might be able to solve a problem.
Yeah, well, I guess we're talking in very general terms about, what this problem might be. It surely would be applicable. I mean, that's in some ways it's a strength and weakness that, most of these solutions can be applied across all sectors. But, what I would suggest is if you can find application in a more progressive area, I hesitate to say defence, but defence is where a lot of the funding is, then that gives you an opportunity to actually trial that solution. But it also helps you in terms of actually addressing whether it's a problem worth solving. Because if you can't convince, one of these industries that it's a problem worth solving, then, you can come up with a solution and maybe it is relevant, but, sometimes things can be created before their time as well. But defence is, reasonably progressive. It's probably, I would target one of the sectors that is most progressive in its application of AI already. And then it might be that you find that it's actually applicable somewhere completely different. I mean, it was an interesting example of this when I was at CSIRO, where, they've spent many years having a look at how you can develop sensors for the environment. and developed this a system called Bluetooth low energy asset tracking. And they never really thought about how that could be applied from a business perspective. And they just sort of had a showcase event one day where industry people came through, and a young construction startup came through and went, well, we could use this for tracking assets on a construction site. And the researchers were like, yeah, sure, because they're researchers, they don't work in construction. So like it wasn't a problem that had ever entered their minds. And, you know, we've since found that that particular technology could be applied across a range of different sectors. So it really is about trying to find enough connection points that you can see where that can be applied. And in their case, I mean, obviously it was applicable in the environment and they had funding to continue that research. But if you can't find that first connection, it's pretty hard.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sue. And if you have further questions, yeah, feel free to contact us or contact Sue directly. I'm sure, well, she may have some time to answer or not, but she'll probably be happy to hear some more opinions. Thanks, Sue, again.
Thanks, Terry.